The rain on Kepler 442F didn't fall so much as it attacked. Jonah Reeves had lived on this dustball colony for 7 years, and he still wasn't used to the way the storms came screaming across the plateau like they had a personal vendetta against anything standing upright. Tonight was worse than usual, the kind of weather that made even the mining rigs shut down and the bar crowds thin out early. He was 3 knuckles deep in the guts of a cargo hauler's iron drive when the pounding started. Not the rain. Something else. Something deliberate against his workshop door. Jonah didn't move immediately. Out here on the rim, unexpected visitors after dark usually meant one of 3 things. Somebody's ship had catastrophically failed, someone was catastrophically drunk, or someone was about to make your life catastrophically complicated. He wiped his hands on a rag that had given up on cleanliness sometime during the previous administration and walked toward the entrance, his boots crunching on the metal floor plating. The pounding came again, weaker this time. Yeah, hold on," he muttered, hitting the release panel. "If you're here to tell me about the extended warranty on my—" The words died in his throat. The figure that collapsed across his threshold was tall, taller than him, and wearing what his brain registered as armor even though most of it was slag and scoring. But that wasn't what made his hand instinctively reach for the plasma cutter he'd left on the workbench. It was the ears. Long, swept back, unmistakable even in the dim light and rain. Zalthurian. For a moment that stretched like bad hyperspace navigation, Jonah just stared. His mind did what minds do when confronted with impossibilities. It tried to file the information under problem for tomorrow and move on. But the spreading pool of dark blood on his floor made it clear that tomorrow was going to be too late. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," he said to the universe in general, which continued to not care about his problems. He grabbed the Zalthurian under the arms and dragged her inside, slapping the door control with his elbow. The storm immediately muffled to a dull roar. Up close, she was in worse shape than he'd thought. Plasma burns across her ribs, visible through the destroyed chest plate. Her breathing was shallow and her skin, which he dimly registered was actually quite similar to human skin, just with a faint violet undertone, was too pale. The armor bore insignia he recognized from intelligence briefings he'd spent 7 years trying to forget. Crimson Guard. Elite. The kind of soldier who could probably kill him 6 ways before breakfast even on a good day. This was not her good day. Jonah's old training kicked in before his common sense could file an objection. He'd been a medic before he'd been anything else in the Terran Defense Force, and some reflexes ran deeper than good judgment. He hauled her onto his workbench. The hauler's iron drive was going to have to wait, and started cutting away the armor plating with industrial shears. "If you die on my table, I'm charging your government for cleaning supplies," he informed the unconscious alien, because talking to patients was part of the protocol, and damned if he was going to let 7 years of civilian life make him sloppy. The next 20 minutes were a blur of synthetic skin sealant, coagulant foam, and improvised field medicine that would have made his old co proud, and his medical instructors resign in horror. The plasma burns were bad but treatable. 3 ribs broken, possibly 4. Some kind of impact trauma to her left shoulder. He worked with the efficiency of someone who'd patched up Marines under fire while artillery painted the sky interesting colors. He was applying the last of the dermal regenerator when her eyes opened. They were violet. Actual violet, like someone had taken the twilight sky and made it into irises. They focused on him with an intensity that made him very aware that he'd left his pistol in the other room, locked in a drawer, like an idiot who thought retirement meant safety. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Not threatening but firm, strong enough that he knew she could snap bone if she wanted to. "Lieutenant Commander Jonah Reeves," she said, her voice rough but clear. She spoke perfect Terran standard without a trace of accent. "Service number TDF 7734 Delta, retired." Jonah's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside. You want to tell me how you know that? He asked quietly, his free hand drifting toward the plasma cutter. Because that information is supposed to be sealed, classified, very much not on the public record classified. She released his wrist and tried to sit up. He almost pushed her back down, but something in her expression stopped him, a mixture of determination and exhaustion that he recognized from his own mirror on bad days. You saved my life once, she said, meeting his eyes. Tarsi's 9, 8 years ago, the field hospital. The words hit him like a kinetic round. Tarsi's 9, the sulfur storms, the screaming, the Zalthurian assault that had turned a medical station into an abattoir. He'd pulled everyone he could into the bunker, human and you, he said slowly, memory crystallizing like frost. The prisoner, you were the prisoner. She nodded, wincing at the movement. I was Intelligence Corps then, junior officer. Captured during reconnaissance. When your position was attacked, you sealed me in the bunker with your wounded. You could have left me outside. Yeah, well. Jonah grabbed his coffee mug from the shelf, discovered it was empty, and set it back down. I was having a really idealistic day, sue me. Instead, she continued, and now there was something else in her voice, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. I have come to return the favor. The workshop suddenly felt very small, and the storm outside very far away. Return the favor, Jonah repeated. You flew across how many light years, got yourself shot to pieces, and crashed on a colony world that doesn't even show up on most navigation charts to return a favor. Yes, why do I get the feeling, Jonah said slowly, that this favor is going to be really complicated? For the first time, the alien warrior smiled. It was not a comforting expression. Because, Lieutenant Commander, you are not stupid. Lyra Vashon had been conscious for 3 hours, and Jonah was beginning to suspect that Zalthurian physiology included a complete immunity to normal human concepts like, take it easy. And you nearly died 12 hours ago. She was sitting at his kitchen table, and calling it a kitchen was generous, since it was really just a corner of the workshop with a heat plate and a protein synthesizer that only worked on Tuesdays, examining her ruined armor with the critical eye of someone mentally calculating repair costs. Her injuries, which should have kept her flat on her back for at least 2 days, seemed to be bothering her about as much as a mild headache bothered a freight hauler pilot. Your medical supplies are adequate, she said, not looking up from the chest plate she was turning over in her hands. Outdated but adequate. You're welcome, Jonah replied, pouring what the synthesizer optimistically labeled as coffee into 2 mugs. I live to meet your adequacy standards. She glanced at him, and he caught that same analytical intensity from before, like she was reading a tactical display only she could see. I apologize. Among my people, acknowledging competence is considered sufficient gratitude. I forget that humans prefer more elaborate social protocols. We also prefer our houseguests to not bleed on the furniture, but here we are. He set 1 mug in front of her. Drink, it won't kill you, probably. Lyra picked up the mug, sniffed it with the caution of a bomb disposal technician, and took a careful sip. Her expression suggested she just sampled industrial coolant. This is coffee. This is what coffee becomes after traveling 6,000 light years in stasis containers and being processed by a synthesizer. I bought third-hand from a Trandoshan who definitely stole it. Jonah dropped into the chair across from her. You were saying something about Tarsi's 9 before you decided to critique my hospitality. The humor drained from her face, replaced by something harder. She set the mug down with deliberate care. How much do you remember about that day? Enough. Jonah stared into his own mug, seeing sulfur-yellow skies and makeshift triage stations. We were 3 days into holding that position. Medical station, non-combatants, wounded. Your people hit us anyway. Rules of engagement went out the airlock. It was not supposed to happen, Lyra said quietly. The assault was unauthorized. A rogue commander seeking glory, willing to commit war crimes for advancement. When High Command discovered what had occurred, there was Significant internal conflict. Internal conflict. Jonah laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. 37 people died in that attack. Doctors, nurses, wounded who couldn't even stand. But I'm glad there was conflict about it. I did not say it was sufficient consequence. Her voice carried an edge now, sharp enough to cut. Merely that it existed. The commander was executed, publicly. His officers were stripped of rank. It did not bring back your dead, but it was our justice. Jonah looked up at her, searching for deception and finding only grim sincerity. You never mentioned any of this in the war tribunals. I was not permitted to testify. I was too junior, and my superiors deemed the incident too politically sensitive. She leaned back, and he saw her wince as the movement pulled at her injuries. But I remembered. I remembered the human officer who dragged me into that bunker along with his own people, who set the mag seal and held that door against plasma fire while the walls melted around us. I was just doing my job. You were saving the enemy. Lyra's violet eyes pinned him in place. 73 people survived that bunker, Lieutenant Commander. 21 were human. 52 were Zalthurian prisoners and wounded from previous engagements. You could have sealed that door with only your people inside. You would have had more supplies, better odds, but you brought us all in. Jonah remembered the weight of that decision, the half-second of calculation. Space for everyone or better chances for some. He'd made the call without thinking it through, running on instinct and whatever idealism hadn't been burned out of him yet. So what? He said finally. You flew across half the galaxy to tell me I made the numbers work. To say thanks for not being a war criminal. No. Lyra reached into a sealed pocket in her armor's underlayer and pulled out a data chip no bigger than her thumbnail. It gleamed like a small, dangerous star in the dim light. I came because that decision, your decision, changed me, changed how I saw humanity. When I returned to my people, I carried that truth with me. Humans were not the monsters our propaganda claimed. You were soldiers fighting for survival, capable of mercy even in hell. She placed the chip on the table between them with a soft click. I rose through the ranks quickly after the war. My experience with humans was considered valuable. I became an advocate for the armistice, for peace, for finding common ground between our peoples. Her expression darkened. This made me powerful. It also made me enemies. Jonah looked at the chip, then back at her. Let me guess. Someone didn't like your peace and love routine. Elements within the Crimson Guard never accepted the armistice. They see it as weakness, as surrender. They have been consolidating power, waiting for an opportunity to resume hostilities. She tapped the chip. 3 months ago, I discovered their plan, a false flag operation. They intend to attack a human civilian station, Kepler Station in the Arcturus sector, and make it appear as though a human extremist group attacked it. 17,000 people, Lieutenant Commander. 17,000 civilians murdered to restart a war. The workshop seemed to contract around them. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady drumming, but inside, the silence was deafening. That chip, Jonah said slowly, is proof. Communications, financial transfers, attack plans, everything needed to expose the conspiracy. Lyra's jaw tightened. They discovered I had it 2 weeks ago. I barely escaped my own flagship. They destroyed my ship in orbit above this world. They are hunting me now, and they will not stop until I am dead and that data is destroyed. Jonah pushed his coffee away and ran both hands through his hair. So you came here, to a forgotten colony at the ascent of nowhere, because 8 years ago, a human officer taught me that some people do the right thing regardless of cost. Lyra met his eyes, and there was no manipulation in her gaze, only desperate honesty. I need to transmit this data to both human and Zalthurian networks simultaneously, so it cannot be suppressed or dismissed as propaganda. But I cannot do it alone. I need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the stakes, someone I can trust. You're asking me to help you start an interstellar incident. I am asking you to help me prevent a war. She leaned forward. "They are coming, Jonah. My people and yours, the conspirators, will not allow this information to survive. They tracked me here. We have perhaps 2 days before they arrive in force." Jonah stared at the data chip, that tiny piece of crystalline memory that contained enough explosives to reshape galactic politics. He thought about the life he'd built here, the quiet routine of fixing ships and avoiding complications. He thought about 17,000 civilians who didn't know they were already casualties of a war that hadn't started yet. 2 days, he repeated, perhaps less. And you picked my door to collapse on, because you figured I was dumb enough to help. For the first time since the serious conversation began, Lyra's expression softened slightly. "I picked your door because you are brave enough to help. There is a difference." Jonah picked up the data chip, feeling its weight, insignificant in grams, enormous in consequences. "You know this is insane, right? I am familiar with the concept. And you know that even if we succeed, both our governments are going to have very pointed questions about how we got this information and why we're suddenly best friends. I anticipate significant political inconvenience, yes. Despite everything, the danger, the impossibility, the sheer cosmic absurdity of the situation, Jonah found himself laughing. Political inconvenience, that's one way to put it. He closed his fist around the chip. "All right, but if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. And my way involves a lot more improvisation and a lot less Crimson Guard tactical doctrine." Lyra smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I would expect nothing less from the man who held a bunker door with a plasma cutter and pure stubbornness." "That's Lieutenant Commander Stubborn to you," Jonah said, standing up. "Now let's figure out how to save the galaxy before your murderous colleagues show up and ruin my weekend." The thing about Zalthurians, Jonah discovered over the next 36 hours, was that they had absolutely no concept of what constituted a reasonable breakfast hour. Lyra had woken him at what his datapad claimed was 5 in the morning, but what his body insisted was still the middle. "I should begin shooting people who wake me up before dawn," Jonah had replied, but he'd gotten up anyway, because the alternative was listening to her list all the tactical vulnerabilities of his workshop in alphabetical order. Now, as the colony's anemic sun struggled over the horizon, they were on the roof of his workshop, which he'd never actually been on before and was discovering had some concerning structural issues, surveying what Lyra kept calling the approach vectors, and what Jonah called the empty dirt where nothing ever happens. "They will come from the east," Lyra said, pointing toward a ridge line that looked identical to every other ridge line on this dust-covered rock. "Standard Zalthurian rapid deployment doctrine calls for high ground advantage and they'll come from the west," Jonah interrupted, pulling out a dented pair of binoculars. "Because that's where the settlement is, and they'll want to blend in with civilian traffic as long as possible. Your people might love their tactical doctrine, but they love not getting noticed even more." Lyra considered this, her head tilted in that way that made her ears catch the morning light. "You have a point, though it assumes they care about civilian casualties. They care about not starting an interstellar incident before they've finished starting their other interstellar incident." Jonah lowered the binoculars. "Trust me, I've spent 7 years watching how smugglers, bounty hunters, and various other unpleasant people operate on frontier worlds. Stealth beats tactics every time. You have become cynical in retirement. I've become realistic. There's a difference." He headed for the roof access ladder. "Come on. If we're going to broadcast your galaxy-saving evidence, we need better equipment than my workshop transmitter. That thing can barely reach orbital relay stations, and half the time it just orders me protein supplements I didn't ask for." They spent the morning raiding the colony's salvage yards, which on Kepler 442F was less raiding, and more politely asking Old Pete if they could borrow some of his junk. Old Pete, who'd lost his left arm to a mining accident and replaced it with what appeared to be a crane attachment, was surprisingly accommodating, Once Jonah promised him first pick of parts from the next ship that came through. "You're bringing interesting friends around these days," Pete observed, eyeing Lyra with the frank curiosity of someone who'd seen enough weird things in 40 years of frontier living that alien warriors barely registered. "She military." "Consultant," Jonah said smoothly, hefting a quantum relay amplifier that had probably been cutting-edge technology when his grandfather was young. "We're working on a communications project." Pete's mechanical arm whirred as he pulled down a signal processor from a high shelf. "This communications project got anything to do with those fancy ships that have been burning hard for this system the last day or so?" Jonah and Lyra exchanged glances. "Ships?" Lyra asked, her voice carefully neutral. "3 of them, according to the Deep Space Relay Station. Moving fast, not broadcasting IFF codes. The kind of ships that make colony administrators nervous and freelance mechanics very curious." Pete grinned with too many missing teeth. "But I figure if Jonah's involved, it's probably either very legal or very necessary, and I'm old enough not to care which." "It's necessary," Jonah said quietly. "Very necessary." Pete nodded slowly, then grabbed 2 more components and dropped them into Jonah's arms. "Then you'd better get moving. On the house. Just try not to get my scrapyard blown up in whatever you're doing." "No promises," Jonah called over his shoulder as they hurried out. Back at the workshop, they spread their salvaged equipment across every available surface. Lyra examined each component with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation, while Jonah started sketching connection diagrams on a datapad. "This is insufficient," Lyra said, holding up a corroded power coupling. "We need triple redundancy for a transmission of this magnitude. If we lose signal halfway through, then we improvise." Jonah pulled open a storage locker and started extracting cables. "Look, I know Zalthurian military equipment is all precision engineered and built to withstand nuclear strikes or whatever, but human technology works on a different principle. Good enough, and if it breaks, hit it until it works again. That is not a principle, that is barely a methodology. And yet, we've been beating you people at improvised field repairs for the entire duration of our mutual acquaintance." Jonah started connecting components with the kind of creative disregard for manufacturer specifications that would make engineers weep. "You want perfection, or you want it working by tonight." Lyra opened her mouth, closed it, then picked up a soldering iron. "I am going to regret this." "Probably," Jonah agreed cheerfully. "But you'll regret it alive, which beats the alternative." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the kind that settles between people who have been in trenches together, literal or metaphorical. Jonah found himself sneaking glances at her, trying to reconcile the elite Zalthurian warrior with the woman who'd spent 10 minutes arguing with his protein synthesizer about the proper definition of edible that morning. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, twisting wire connections with practiced efficiency. "You are going to regardless of my answer." "Fair point." He set down his tools. "Why didn't you just transmit this data the moment you got it? 3 months ago, you said. Why run? Why come here? You could have dumped it on the networks from your flagship and let the pieces fall where they may." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling over the circuit board she'd been assembling. "Because I was a coward," she said finally. "I told myself I needed verification, more evidence, the perfect moment. But the truth is that I knew what transmitting that information would mean. The end of my career, possibly my life, certainly everything I had built. So what changed? They decided to kill me anyway." She looked up, and there was something raw in her expression. "When your enemies make the decision for you, it becomes remarkably easy to be brave. But also, I thought about that bunker on Tarsi's 9. About you dragging me inside when you could have left me to burn. You did not hesitate, did not calculate the cost. You just acted." "Yeah, well." Jonah picked up his tools again, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm told I don't think things through properly. I believe the human phrase is doing the right thing despite the consequences. Lyra resumed her work, but he could hear the slight smile in her voice. I decided it was time I tried your approach. My approach involves a lot more last-minute panic and questionable decisions. I have noticed. A proximity alarm chirped from Jonah's security panel. Basic civilian equipment that he'd installed mostly to warn him when drunk miners wandered too close to his fuel reserves. He pulled up the display and felt his stomach drop. Lyra. She was beside him in an instant, reading the screen over his shoulder. 3 contacts, coming in fast and low from the west, just like he'd predicted. They'd be at the workshop in less than 15 minutes. They are early, Lyra said quietly. They're motivated. Jonah's mind raced through options, discarding most of them immediately. The transmitter setup was maybe 60% complete. They needed at least another 2 hours, probably 3. Can you buy us time? Talk to them, negotiate, do the whole "I'm one of you" thing. They sent assassination teams, not diplomats. She moved to the window, her body language shifting into something predatory. They will attempt to kill me and destroy the data. Conversation is not their objective. Great, fantastic. Jonah pulled open his weapons locker, which contained exactly 1 functioning plasma pistol and a mining charge that he was pretty sure had expired. I don't suppose you've got any brilliant Zalthurian tactical solutions hiding in that strategic brain of yours. Lyra turned back to him, and despite everything, the approaching killers, the half-finished transmitter, the extremely high probability of imminent death, she was smiling. I believe you said we would do this your way. Improvisation and stubbornness, correct? That's a terrible plan. It is your plan. I know that's why it's terrible. Jonah checked the plasma pistol's charge and wondered when his life had become this complicated. All right, new priority. We finish the transmitter, we broadcast your data, and we try very hard not to die. In that order. A sound strategy. It's an insane strategy, but it's what we've got. He tossed her a tool belt loaded with equipment that could be repurposed as weapons if you were creative and desperate enough. Welcome to how humans fight wars. We make it up as we go and hope the universe has a sense of humor. Outside, the whine of approaching ships grew louder, and Jonah discovered that retirement had been very peaceful and he'd like to have it back. Please and thank you. But Lyra was already moving, turning his workshop into something resembling a defensive position, and he found himself grinning despite the fear. For the record, he called out, this is definitely the most complicated favor anyone's ever asked me to return. I will endeavor to make my next life debt significantly simpler, Lyra replied, and somehow that made everything slightly less terrifying. The first shuttle touched down in a cloud of dust and displaced gravel approximately 30 seconds before Jonah finished wiring the last relay connection. He had just enough time to think that the universe had a really terrible sense of comedic timing before Lyra shoved him behind a support beam, and plasma fire started chewing through his front wall. I just repainted that last month, Jonah shouted over the sound of his workshop being systematically ventilated. Send them an invoice, Lyra replied, returning fire with a weapon she'd apparently been hiding in her boot this entire time. How long until transmission? Jonah glanced at the jury-rigged equipment, watching status indicators blink through their initialization sequences with the speed of continental drift. 4 minutes if everything works perfectly. 6 if it works like everything I've ever built. Never if they shoot the transmitter. Then we ensure they do not shoot the transmitter. Lyra dropped 3 smoke charges that Jonah hadn't even known she was carrying, filling the workshop with dense gray fog that smelled like burnt electronics and poor life choices. The Zalthurian assassins were professional enough not to charge blindly into smoke, which meant they were also smart enough to be dangerous. Jonah heard them spreading out, moving with the coordinated precision of people who killed for a living and were very good at their job. He clutched his plasma pistol and tried to remember the last time he'd fired it, which had been at a targeting range 4 years ago where he'd scored adequate and called it good enough. Something moved in the smoke. Jonah fired twice, missing both times but succeeding in making the something retreat behind his broken fusion welder. A voice called out in Zalthurian, sharp and commanding. "They are offering terms," Lyra translated, her back pressed against his. "Surrender the data, they will make my death quick and allow you to live." "That's generous of them." "They are lying." "I figured." Jonah checked the transmitter again. 3 minutes. The equipment was screaming through processing cycles, compressing Lyra's evidence into a tight beam burst that would hit every relay station in range simultaneously. "Can you tell them we're considering their offer? Buy us time." Lyra shouted something back in Zalthurian that sounded diplomatic but probably wasn't, based on the way the assassins immediately started shooting again. Plasma bolts carved through the smoke, and Jonah felt heat wash past his face close enough to singe his eyebrows. "What did you tell them?" he demanded. "That their mothers were cargo haulers and their tactical doctrine was designed by planetary worms." "That's not buying time, that's making them angry." "Yes, but now they are angry and careless." Lyra grabbed his shoulder and hauled him sideways just as a plasma bolt scorched through the space where his head had been. 2 minutes. Close enough. Jonah could see the lead assassin now through gaps in the smoke, tall and armored and moving with lethal purpose toward the transmitter. He did something that his old co would have called tactically inadvisable, and his therapist would have called a cry for help. He stood up and threw his expired mining charge at the assassin's head. It bounced off the Zalthurian's helmet with a hollow thunk and clattered to the floor, not exploding because it was expired, and also because Jonah hadn't armed it. But the assassin didn't know that. He dove for cover, shouting warnings to his team, and for 5 beautiful seconds everybody stopped shooting and started running. "That was either brilliant or suicidal," Lyra observed. "I'm leaning toward suicidal," Jonah admitted, watching the transmission counter tick down. 1 minute. 45 seconds. The equipment was holding together through sheer spite and improper voltage regulation, which was basically how all his best work functioned. The assassins figured out the mining charge wasn't going to explode approximately the same time they figured out what the transmitter was doing. They came at it from 3 angles simultaneously, and Lyra met them with the kind of violence that reminded Jonah exactly why the Crimson Guard had a galaxy-wide reputation. She moved like water and struck like collapsing stars, and he was suddenly very glad she'd been unconscious when she'd arrived on his doorstep. 20 seconds. The lead assassin broke through, plasma rifle tracking toward the transmitter's core. Jonah shot him in the shoulder, adequate marksmanship coming through in the clutch, and the Zalthurian staggered but didn't go down. Professional, dedicated, extremely inconvenient. 10 seconds. Jonah could see the assassin's finger tightening on the trigger, the plasma rifle's charge indicator going critical. He did the only thing he could think of, which was tackle a trained killer twice his size while screaming something that was probably not appropriate for mixed company. They hit the ground together, the plasma rifle discharging into the ceiling and bringing down a shower of insulation and wiring. The assassin headbutted him, which hurt significantly more than Jonah had expected, and he tasted copper and failure. But Lyra was there, her boot connecting with the Zalthurian's helmet hard enough to crack the visor. 0 seconds. The transmitter pulsed once, bright and clean, and Jonah felt the electromagnetic wash of a successful broadcast ripple through his fillings. The data was away, spreading through relay networks faster than any authority could suppress it, reaching human and Zalthurian civilian networks simultaneously. Proof of conspiracy. Evidence of war crimes. The truth, messy and complicated and impossible to ignore. The assassins froze, receiving status updates through their tactical networks. Jonah watched their body language shift from aggressive to uncertain. One of them said something that sounded like a question. Another responded with what was definitely a curse. "They are being recalled," Lyra said quietly, blood running from a cut above her eye. "Their handlers know the mission is compromised. They are withdrawing." Just like that, Jonah struggled to his feet, his ribs informing him that tackling armored soldiers was not recommended for retired mechanics. They're just leaving. Killing us now accomplishes nothing. The data is distributed. She watched the assassins retreat toward their shuttles with the wary attention of someone who'd survived by never trusting an enemy's withdrawal. They will face prosecution. We have won. The shuttles lifted off, thrusters scorching his yard and probably violating several colonial ordinances. Jonah waited until they'd cleared the atmosphere before letting himself collapse against the ruined transmitter, which was smoking gently and would never work again, but had done its job beautifully. "We won," he repeated, testing the words. "We actually won." "You sound surprised." "I am surprised. My plans usually involve more explosions and less success." He looked around his destroyed workshop, calculating repair costs and deciding they were someone else's problem. "So what happens now? Your people investigate, my people investigate. Everyone gets very excited about interstellar conspiracy." "Most likely." Lyra sat down beside him, and for a moment they were just two exhausted veterans surrounded by wreckage. "There will be trials, reforms, possibly another peace summit, though I suspect I will not be invited to represent my government after this." "Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure my quiet retirement just ended too." Jonah found a relatively clean rag and pressed it to the cut on her forehead. "We're going to be famous, or infamous, possibly both. Does this trouble you?" He considered that question, thinking about 7 years of peace and routine, and carefully maintained distance from anything complicated. Then he thought about 17,000 civilians who would wake up tomorrow not knowing they were alive because 2 veterans had decided to do something stupidly heroic. "No," he said finally. "I think I'm okay with it." 3 weeks later, after the investigations had started and the media firestorm had achieved nuclear temperatures, Jonah stood in his rebuilt workshop and watched the news feeds. Both human and Zalthurian governments had arrested the conspirators, the quiet life he'd fought to earn, but it was nice to pretend the universe worked differently. "I'll visit," she said. "You'd better. Someone needs to appreciate my coffee." "Your coffee is still terrible." "Yeah, but now you know that's part of its charm." Jonah walked her to the landing pad where a diplomatic shuttle was waiting, all official and proper. "Hey, Lyra." She turned, one hand on the boarding ramp. "Thanks for the favor," he said. "For trusting me with this, for remembering. Thank you for teaching me what mercy looks like." She smiled, those violet eyes catching the morning light. "For showing me that the galaxy can be better than we make it." The shuttle lifted off, carrying her toward whatever came next. Jonah watched it disappear into the atmosphere, then turned back toward his workshop. Old Pete was already waiting with a list of ships that needed repairs, and life on Kepler 442F continued its steady, unremarkable rhythm. But something had changed. Jonah felt it in the way colonists nodded to him on the street, in the messages from former comrades asking if he was okay, in the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, people were alive because he'd done the right thing when it mattered. He'd left the war thinking he was done being a soldier. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe being a soldier wasn't about fighting wars but about protecting peace, one impossible decision at a time. His datapad chirped with an incoming message. From Lyra, already in orbit. "Your welding on the transmitter was still terrible. Next time I bring proper equipment." Jonah grinned and sent back. "Next time, you bring better warnings about assassins." "Agreed, though I hope there is no next time." "Yeah," Jonah typed, looking up at the sky where somewhere among the stars, the galaxy was learning what humans had always known. That mercy was stronger than weapons, and compassion could change the fate of worlds. May 2.